My name is Meehan Crist. By way of intro, I'll just say I'm the writer in residence in biological sciences at Columbia University. And we have two distinguished thinkers here on stage. I'm going to read their bios very quickly. If I look at my phone during this event, it's not because I'm checking my emails, because everything's on my phone. So please forgive me for that. So let's see. Kohei Saito is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Tokyo and a leading contemporary Marxist thinker. His most recent book, Capital in the Anthropocene, has sold more than 500,000 copies in Japan and was published in English as Slowdown, the Degrowth Manifesto in January 2024. Saito's previous book, Karl Marx's Eco-Socialism, Capital, Nature, and the Unfinished Critique of Political Economy, published in 2017, which creatively explored the ecological dimension of Marx's thought and its contemporary relevance, won the Deutscher Memorial Prize. David Wallace-Wells, over there on the other end, is a columnist and staff writer at the New York Times, where he writes a weekly newsletter on climate change, technology, and the future of the planet. It's really good. If you don't get it, you should. He's the author of the #1 New York Times bestseller, The Uninhabitable Earth, Life After Warming, published in 2019, a travelogue of the near future and meditation on how it will look to those living through it. Wallace-Wells was previously the deputy editor at New York Magazine, deputy editor of the Paris Review, and a national fellow at the New America Foundation. So with that, I think maybe we'll just jump right in. We are here to talk about degrowth. So I thought it would make sense to start with this question: what is degrowth? It's not actually that simple. So I'm curious, what is the simplest way you could articulate what degrowth is?
That's big.
Yeah,
I mean, I hate that question because it's too big. Because it's not a very good way to start, because degrowth is actually a negation, right? So people can associate with many things, and that's the vagueness. But at the same time, we first have to look at the current system. And then there are problems, and then the solution becomes more clear, and then what I call degrowth is that solution. But not just degrowth, I advocate for degrowth communism. And without that part, it doesn't really make sense, in my opinion. But the problem of capitalism that I want to highlight is basically two main contradictions manifesting in all over the world, especially in the US. One is economic inequality, enlarging, some rich people accumulate even more wealth using their own wealth. So this is like a Thomas Piketty thing. Eh? And then the other one is obviously the ecological contradiction. And the one most obvious one recently is a climate crisis. And the problem is this climate crisis is a chronic issue that will only get worse and worse in the future. And it will lead to various kinds of natural disasters, leading to food and water shortages and accelerating inflation. And the inflation, of course, makes inequality even worse. And also in the many poor countries, they will have serious problems. And then there will be more and more climate refugees. And then those people will come to the US or come to European countries. And then in those countries, they will try to defend themselves from those refugees, and then the rise of right-wing populists, xenophobia, and then leading to the crisis of democracy. So we have the polycrisis of capital accumulation, crisis of ecology, crisis of the earth, and then crisis of democracy. And then this really means that we are not allowed to continue the business as usual, because capitalism is not adequately responding to this crisis. It's been failing since years. After the pandemic and even the climate crisis and the war, and these are the things that we are not supposed to deal with in this way. Why? Because capitalism is a system that actually put importance on profit and growth, not protecting people's life, not satisfying people's desire. Capitalism only does this only insofar as it is useful for making more profit, right? So in a sense, the growth came to the point where it is no longer productive or efficient, because growth could be achieved by sacrificing people's lives. Growth could be achieved by destroying the planet and so on. So I think we came to the point where we really have to rethink how we live, how we organize our society, and how we organize the entire economy. And degrowth is a proposal. We end with this excessive obsession with constant growth because our world, planet, is basically finite and infinite growth is not possible. So that's like basically the beginning. And then we have to think, then what's gonna do? We're gonna, no longer growth and we're gonna be all poor, unemployment, and so on and so on. So basically that raises a lot of questions because we are so used to this kind of growth thinking. But that way of new thinking is necessary because what we are experiencing right now is something that we never experienced before. So this is all the new challenges. And the degrowth doesn't have the concrete name at this point because it only problematizes this existing polycrisis.
What's your understanding of degrowth?
Well, I mean, on the definition, I defer to Kohei, but I think a little bit. It's. I feel I'm a funny fit on stage next to you because while I'm certainly not a critic of degrowth, I'm also not
a very active provocateur of degrowth.
I'm somewhere in between. I'm not. And I think I have a kind of a complicated, complex view about what it is and how it fits into the conversation, and might be worth just spelling out a little bit some of that context and caveating, and especially as the idea relates to the climate crisis, since as you say, it has applications beyond the climate crisis, but it's also gained currency, become a really prominent talking point, and generated a lot of argumentation and discourse in the context of solving or addressing climate change. And so I want to just sort of, as a starting thing, make sort of 4 points about that, about the complications and the confusions that have somewhat, I think, arisen in the last few years around the idea of degrowth. The first is, when you look at the energy transition that we need to make, there's a lot of, there are a lot of things in there that it's not easy to know whether to call them green growth or degrowth. At the moment when you burn fossil fuels, you lose 60+% of the power to waste heat. So if we electrify everything and go green, we could provide the same amount of power to the same amount of people using 1/3 the input. Is that green growth or is that degrowth? The mining that would be required to produce that green, revolution, that green industrial revolution is significant. It's destructive in certain parts of the world with local impacts. We need to worry about those spillover effects. But when you look at it at the global level, most estimates suggest that the mining that we would have to do to get all the way to net zero is like 1% of the extraction that we now do for oil and gas. So do you call that trade-off a degrowth proposition or a green growth proposition? The same is true of of land use. The contrasts are not quite so clear, but something like if the U.S. was entirely green tomorrow, we'd probably be using half as much land to source our energy as we are today using to source energy. I think we'd actually be using less than today we're using to produce ethanol, which is like a totally wasted fuel. So again, if we imagine trespassing that threshold and living in a future in which we've achieved that transition, was the thing we just lived through a process of green growth in which we built a whole new industrial infrastructure, or was it a process of degrowth in which we actually were making do with a lot less and still providing quite a lot for our citizens? And a lot of those, those figures are sort of hold globally, even though most of the stuff I was citing is from the U.S. So that's one thing. It's like, in a lot of cases, what we have to do is not all that clearly described as either one or the other. Advocates of degrowth say this all the time. Like, we definitely do need to green the planet, even if it means, a new industrial revolution. The second thing is that, there are a lot of complementarities here, and we often, I think, in conversations about degrowth, fall into binaries and opposition, have ideological arguments about it, which essentially amount to like whether you're a supporter of capitalism or a supporter of socialism or communism. But ultimately, even the IPCC, which is a pretty establishment, pretty market-friendly, pretty government-friendly, it's not a revolutionary body. Even they have been emphasizing more and more what we need to do in terms of reducing demand for the products of dirty energy. Green growth, degrowth advocates will say like, yeah, we need to build a lot of solar panels, we need to build a lot of wind panels. So for me, it's sort of easier to see this problem not in terms of binaries, but in terms of complementarities, which is to say there's like some things we probably need to do in a degrowth context, and there are other things that we probably need to do in a green growth industrial context to solve, again, just thinking of it in terms of the climate crisis. And then the third thing is to say that degrowth is often talked about and often kind of criticized as being a sort of a radical challenge to the status quo. And in certain ways, of course, that's true. But it's also the case that the status quo as it exists today is in a protracted form of real crisis. And I don't just say that because we've seen over the last 15, 20 years how much more jagged a sort of growth at all costs model can be for people all around the world, and not just because you see an increasing number of Nobel laureates in economics coming out for some amount of reform to neoliberalism or the market system, but also because even given how difficult the market forces of the last 20 years have been for the world, they still also haven't been able to secure real growth in much of the world. So if what we have is a global system that's really dedicated to growth at all costs, it's not even succeeding on that front. In Japan, the per capita GDP is less than it was in 1995. In the EU, per capita GDP has only grown 1% since the financial crisis. In sub-Saharan Africa, we've had a decade of global economic shrinking, of GDP shrinking. And even in the places that are seen as success stories over the last decade or two, namely the US and China. In the US, we've had slower growth rates than we've had in the past. And same in China. They're coming from a much higher level, but they're still slowing. And that's really consequential, the China case in particular, because when you hear critics of degrowth, advocates of green growth, advocates of capitalism in a sort of simplistic model talking about the value of the status quo system, they will often point to poverty reduction around the world over the last couple of decades, but something like 70% of that poverty reduction took place in China, which raises questions about really what we mean when we talk about the success of market liberalism in the world and its effect on global poverty. And that raises the sort of last complication that I would offer at the outset, with apologies for like offering so many caveats, but we often talk about the proposal of degrowth. It often gets debated and discussed in terms of ideological questions, material questions, like what is enough, especially for people living in the global north. It's often discussed in terms of domestic politics, what will voters tolerate, that kind of thing. But especially when I think about these questions in the global context, I'm thinking about them primarily in terms of global inequality, geopolitics. And just to put a few numbers on that to make the dynamics really stark, or I hope make them stark. The US EPA recently revised what is called its social cost of carbon, which is its estimate for how much damage gets done every time you put 1 ton of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. The estimate they settled on was $190 per ton, but it's in 2019 dollars. So in contemporary dollars, it's like $220 a ton. And by that figure, this is the Joe Biden EPA. This is not like some fringe climate group, and it's not Kohei doing like degrowth advocacy. According to the US government's official estimate, the US is doing $1 trillion of climate damages every single year. $1 trillion a year. And we went to the COP conference where there was all this celebration about a loss and damage fund being established. Finally, the rich nations of the world are going to help the poor nations of the world adapt to the future that they've damaged, the rich nations. Big deal, big celebration. There's a big loss and damage fund. The US, whose own agencies estimate that we're doing $1 trillion of damage a year, show up and they offer to that fund $17 million. I mean, literally, there are 5 players on the Boston Celtics who are making more money than $17 million a year. And that is what the US, who is doing $1 trillion in damages every year, is offering to the Loss and Damage Fund. And that's just in the present tense. Going back, the US is responsible for for something like 25% of all historical emissions, and they do hang up there for centuries. That means that the US as a nation is responsible for something like 10 to 20 times as much carbon in the atmosphere as all of sub-Saharan Africa, which is 1.2 billion people. The US is responsible for 10 to 20 times as much damage. The average American refrigerator uses more carbon than the average resident of Nigeria. The average resident of Mali uses only as much carbon as the average British tea kettle. These are like insane carbon inequalities that we're living with today. And of course, the damages follow the inverse rule, which is it's the poorest countries in the world who are being hit hardest. They are already being hit quite hard. We're discounting that damage because we simply don't value the lives of people living in poor parts of the world as much as we value the lives of people living in the north. The global economic models that have been put forward suggesting that climate change would not be all that catastrophic economically are models that would take a 50% reduction in Indian GDP and a 5% increase of American GDP and say that that was a wash. And that is like a grotesque way of thinking about these issues. And so, plenty of people in America, in parts of Europe, will Kohei's experience on book tour could attest to this. I think people will be like, oh, degrowth, like that freaks me out. But what we're really talking about is how do we design a future in which, and how do we engineer a future in which all of these problems that are related but also distinct can be addressed at once. How can we? Is it possible? Can we deal with the climate crisis and the ecological crisis and the inequality crisis and the democracy crisis? Can we do all of those things at once? I'm not an advocate. I'm more of like a observer, analyst, and the fact that all of those things are so pressing at the moment worries me. But I imagine, you're an advocate. You probably have a slightly more optimistic view of what can be done.
I think it's also important to clarify what degrowth is not. Because it's this term that's become sort of, trendy, and it's kind of popping around the media ecosphere without a lot of actual analysis about what people are talking about. And to be clear, degrowth is a very big tent, right? There's not one thing that is degrowth. There are a bunch of different ways of thinking about it and approaches. And you have this approach of degrowth communism, which is very specific and rooted in a very specific kind of political agenda, and people have other versions of degrowth rooted in other agendas, and then there are people who are just sort of interested in degrowth as a possibility because it seems like nothing else is working, and so maybe we should talk about degrowth. But I do think it's important to say that
also people on the other side who use it as a straw man.
Right, as a straw man, right. So, for example, degrowth is not reducing the GDP, right? That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about changing fundamentally what the economy does, right? So there were some people that gave really sort of bad faith arguments around the time of the coronavirus lockdowns where they were like, see, this is what happens when you do degrowth. Everything falls apart and it's catastrophic and terrible. That wasn't degrowth, right? Degrowth is a planned shifting of the economy such that certain things that are deemed unnecessary for human well-being get sort of cut out of the economy, right? Less tchotchkes, less keychains, less bullshit, and more healthcare, more education, right? Spend the energy of the economy not making stuff for profit, but making stuff for human well-being, right? If you do that, if you start making things for human well-being and start reducing the kinds of things that you're making for profit, because at the root of this is also the fact that we need to reduce throughput, right? This is the sort of revolutionary idea about degrowth, is that it's not that we want to have less money in some kind of metric. It's that we want to reduce the amount of material and energy that is being run through the economy. Because right now we're using far too much of it. And by we, I mean the sort of overdeveloped global north. And this is also the proposition, we'll get to this later, is that the idea is that you need degrowth in overdeveloped economies so that developed economies can find their own ways towards sustainable economic growth. I don't even want to say sustainable there because that's like a keyword for something else. Let's imagine there's a world in which you can have underdeveloped economies figuring out what kinds of economies they want to create in order to have the well-being of the citizens that they are trying to serve. It's really rethinking what an economy is for, right? And that it is profoundly radical. It's a radical idea. But it's also interesting that the idea that economy should be for growth is kind of new, right? You can trace this to maybe Adam Smith, and there are thinkers that have sort of, thought about growing the economy being good for people. But we're really talking about a post-World War II situation in which, particularly in the US, but across Europe as well, the idea that a growing economy is going to be good, and that is the thing that it's for, we're talking about a number of decades, really. But it is so deeply now entrenched in the way that we think about how economies work, how money works, what jobs are for, what unemployment is and why it happens, that
how politics work.
How politics work, right? You can't have politics without economic growth. You can't get elected if you're not going to promise growth, right? So I think the idea that degrowth is not make the GDP smaller, and degrowth is also not a recession, right? A recession is unplanned, chaotic. It causes unemployment rather than sort of creating jobs. The idea of degrowth is and you can argue whether you think this is possible or feasible or manageable or any of those things, but I think the fundamental idea is that it's this sort of orderly transition to a different kind of economy, which is not the same thing as the economy that we have failing and everyone sort of suffering because of it. So that maybe gets us to the next question.
You should have opened. You should have asked that.
But that's just what it's not. I want to know what it is. So then a question that I have also is, how is this different from a steady state economy? Because that's the other thing you sort of hear. You've got this donut economics and these ideas that you can have a steady state economy. What's the difference between a degrowth economy and a steady state economy?
That's exactly why I use the term degrowth communism, because degrowth could mean kind of degrowth capitalism, right? And but I don't think degrowth capitalism is possible, because capitalism, by definition, this was the conversation that we had with Blanco Milanovic 2 days ago about Schumpeter. He also said stationary capitalism is impossible, because capitalism is actually about making profit, and the profit will be invested again to expand. And basically, this system is about constant expansion and constant increase of then GDP. So stationary economy is also problematic, because people advocate are usually associated with Herman Daly, and he talks about regulating market with some kind of laws, and we introduce certain kind of progressive taxes, and then with some policies and regulation of the market, we could somehow move to stationary economy without really challenging private property system, market functioning, and the money, and so on. So these are really capitalism with some regulation. Yeah? So that, I don't think that's enough, because as you pointed out, we really have to distinguish what is necessary and unnecessary. And that means that we cannot simply impose certain carbon tax. That's not enough. We really have to, for example, ban private jets. That's my favorite example. And the other one is maybe it's necessary to introduce some kind of mandatory veganism or something. Because the crisis is really urgent. When it comes to the point where we cannot no longer live peacefully, remember the pandemic, we did lockdown and so many things that we think it's crazy, but we had to do it when the economy pivots around survival. And the worst case will happen with this climate crisis in decades. So, we cannot simply count on this kind of free competition and with the innovation and that kind of thing. So maybe we have to really regulate certain private property, especially the fossil fuel. We probably have to nationalize in order to shut down all those pipelines and extraction and so on. And these are really the challenge that we have to plan, we have to nationalize, we have to stop so many things. And that could be really violent. I'm not saying that we should all use violence and do something like civil war. That's Andreas Malm, my friend, also talks about. But even if we try to avoid and we try to make a more peaceful transition to a decarbonized economy, it's really not the market logic or a market mechanism that we can simply count on. So that's how we have to kind of accept those like socialist and communist ideas of how we socialize, how we, own means of production collectively so that we can plan the production and so on. And that's one thing. And then when the economy no longer grows, it means that we have to reduce throughput, so the resource and energy resource like usages. We of course use technologies. So degrowth is not about going back to nature, but at the same time, we really have to reduce the number of cars running outside. It's too many. The number of the domestic flights, there are too many. And these are like really excessive things that we have to drastically reduce because technological development alone is not enough, like fast enough. We have like time limit. So in that case, we cannot simply count on the future technology. They will, allow us to fly as much as we do right now or eat as much beef as possible and so on. So then we really have to imagine an economy where the pie of the economy is no longer growing. That means that we have to share more. So share public transportation, share, cars, share resources. The capitalism monopolizes, the super rich people monopolize so many things. It's inefficient. So that when the economy doesn't grow, in the degrowth economy, we have to share more. And sharing is not necessarily a bad thing, right? But sharing, this tradition of sharing is coming from creating commonwealth based on the community management. That's what I refer to as communism. It's not about Chinese Communist Party or Soviet Union. It's about this tradition of sharing the social wealth that has been artificially made scarce under capitalism through commodification. It is a re-commodification of our wealth in society through sharing, mutual aid, and community and care. Now that's a tradition of socialism and communism. So that's why I say degrowth communism. This is something that we have to sort of revitalize in order to kind of regain our imagination in this very difficult time.
So I want to follow up on that with this idea that what you're articulating is for some people a really hard sell, right? It sounds like learning to live with less. It sounds like less abundance and less freedom.
Yeah.
Right?
That it's scary, right?
Right. It sounds scary, right? But it's like if you could just turn a little click, you can actually maybe see how for many people, degrowth offers the hope of freedom from release from a really crushing set of labor and social constraints. And it looks like more freedom and more abundance. And that understanding that shift, whether or not you agree with it or think it's feasible, but understanding why someone would look at degrowth and think, oh, that sounds amazing, right? Instead of looking at degrowth and saying, God, that's going to be so hard. And a politician can't get elected on this. There's little things. So in my apartment building, there's 60 units. Everyone in my apartment building owns a vacuum cleaner. Why do we all have vacuum cleaners? We are not all using our vacuum cleaners at the same time, right? There's a world in which we could all have one vacuum cleaner and we'd all have the money left over and the time that it spent for us to go find that vacuum cleaner and buy it and bring it to our house, right? So this is like a teeny tiny concrete example, but I'm interested in the larger sort of social cultural shift that would have to be necessary, or the kind of mindset that says this looks really good to me as opposed to this looks like a shrinking of abundance.
So we need a moment of dialectic, this negativity of freedom. I sound as if I'm trying to take all the freedom and the joy and everything. This is one moment of negativity, but we need a negation of negation. And this is what I try to do is basically, if we think about capitalism, we have so many commodities and we are so happy, we are so free, but we are not really free. We need all this money, right? And we are compelled to constantly work for so many hours in order to constantly consume in the end. And then, especially in the countries like the US, everything is commodified. Even something that everyone needs, like essential goods, like education, like so expensive. Like, it's really expensive because especially the yen is so weak, and I don't think my son or daughter can come to the US anymore. But anyway, so like hospitals, like so many people died during the COVID, even though the US is the richest country in the world. Why do so many people die? Because the medical care is commodified, and the GDP is totally wasted, right? And it's not used for the sake of saving people's lives. And other things, no trains, no buses, so everyone has to buy a car. So that means like in order to gain education, medical care, mobility, paying rent, you just have to constantly work and doing some kind of bullshit jobs, right? So this is all the things that are making you unhappy and ecologically destructive. So that's two bad sides coming together. And my suggestion is basically then decommodify everything. Right? Free education, free hospital, free public transportation, free internet, and just like reasonable public housing. And then we have all the resources and the capacity, especially in the rich countries like the US. If we do this, we don't have to worry so much constantly about our future, our job, paying back loans and like debt. And then we can spend less time in working and then spend more free time for something you like hobbies, playing soccer, having sex, or whatsoever. And these are the things that you can truly prioritize in your life. But in capitalism, that's why I call capitalism undemocratic. Your life has been predetermined to sacrifice for the sake of capital's profit making. And this is not leading to nowhere. So once you realize this contradiction, degrowth is actually less consumption, but for the sake of working less, more free time, the more security, and more community and more democracy maybe. And so these are the things that you actually gain. I call this like public luxury or communal luxury. These are the luxury that you can actually enjoy freely because in capitalism, everything is artificially made scarce.
So David, as someone who is not an advocate for this, what do you
Why
hear?
Are you convinced?
What do you hear?
Are you
when
now
he's
like
saying
an
this?
advocate of degrowth too?
It's hard to find anything to object to. Like the vision of the world that you're sketching out is pretty appealing on kind of every front. I mean, I would just sort of return to some of the things I was saying at the top, which is I think that the same logic applies even to the to the solutions to the climate crisis that come out of growth, which is to say we have 10 million people dying a year from the air pollution produced from the burning of fossil fuels. Like that needs to be addressed. The way that I think about that is not in terms of a retreat from industrial development or growth. But that's also not to say that I want to run away from many of the aspects of the happier, brighter future that you're describing. I think that more public transportation, more luxury, more communal luxury. These are all very positive things. I guess my big question is just to what extent addressing and stabilizing the climate requires those measures, or to what extent they are sort of adjacent causes which share a lot of supporters because of the kinds of people who care about climate are also the kinds of people who want to engineer certain kinds of, socialistic or quasi-socialistic futures, and then secondarily, what the political appeal of such a message is ultimately, especially given the sort of urgency of the climate changes that we're describing and discussing. So, if it is the case that we really believe that it's necessary to stabilize the world's climate at less than 2 degrees of warming, and that means that we have, 30 years to get to net zero. Is it a more efficient path to that endpoint to undertake a radical, approach to transportation and housing and healthcare in the rich nations of the world, or is it a more straightforward path to that point to undertake some hybrid approach that, that partakes of some of the some of the, appealing future that you're describing, and also like is comfortable with a system continuing that is built on the promises of growth and measured future prosperity. And yeah, my view is not at all dismissive of the value of green growth in certain ways. It just doesn't make up the whole scope of my perspective on the problem. And my inclination is to sort of be a little less ideological about it and be a little more kitchen sink about the solution set. As much as I want to like share my vacuum cleaner, I live in an even bigger building, and I like love sharing the courtyard with my 1,600 cooperative members. But when I think about, I'm not someone who I feel like I'm playing a role that I'm not all that suited for. I don't think that like there's this unchangeable political commitment in places like the U.S. or Northern Europe to the religion of growth. And I don't think that we need to run around terrified of backlash from those people who are going to resist. I think we've actually hugely overstated like the lesson of the Gilets jaunes and the farmers' protests in Europe, which are relatively small compared to other protests that have unfolded in Europe on totally different issues. I think we sort of overstate collectively our cultural resistance to change on these fronts. But I also don't myself feel like the logic of the climate crisis itself pushes me to a place where I can say we must abandon growth and embrace a different model. We may want to do that for other reasons, but the logic of the climate crisis, to me, suggests more of a hybrid solution set.
This is actually one of the criticisms of things like Green Keynesianism or the Green New Deal, is like they just won't happen fast enough. Right? It's just not going to happen. We're not going to hit 1.5, certainly. We're definitely not going to hit that. We're probably not going to hit 2. So, what are we doing? What are we just doing, frittering away all this time? And so then there are some folks who sort of propose degrowth as this alternative measure. But I have to say that for myself, I feel like none of them are going to move fast enough, right?
Well, that raises another related question, which is in a world that's 2.5, maybe 3 degrees, maybe even warmer than that, what does that require of us as moral actors in the world? And I think on that point, I'm much more directly in line with Kohei's view, which is that we really need to be cultivating much more empathy, sympathy, and human care mechanisms. And that it may be that these are, just logically speaking, a more natural product of our coming face to face with ecological destruction and devastation than they are necessarily that part of the solution set to limit that amount of warming. But I also think these are experiments we're running in real time, and it's hard to know how they play out over the long term. Myself, I've been more worried over the last few years about the way that we will adapt to those to that ecological future full of all that additional needless suffering, primarily by normalizing it, rather than even taking care of one another in that future. I think we see that already. It's like all of us in this room list dozens of natural disasters that have surprised us or scared us over the last year, and yet we've already started to think about like the wildfires in Maui or the wildfires in Chile or the wildfires in Australia, just to name some wildfires over the last year, or the wildfires in Canada, which were so big that half the world's countries could fit inside the burn scar. We've started to think of all that, which just happened in the last year. The biggest fires ever in North America, the biggest fires ever in South America, the biggest fires ever, or in like 2 decades in Australia, biggest fires ever in Canada. All of those are just like kind of like background noise already. And I really do worry going forward about whether we will respond to what should be a prompt for a more humane system of mutual aid and care, instead by turning away from each other rather than turning towards one another.
I also wonder if degrowth is not totally incompatible with actually fascist ideologies. Like, I think that there is a way that this could go where, I'm thinking specifically of like Pentti Linkola in Finland, right? He's like sort of Finland for the Finnish, and he's more of a go back to farming and fishing and this kind of thing. But like there's a world in which you could imagine, you don't have to imagine very hard, it's sort of national borders being erected that are violently policed, and internally there's a world of sort of mutual aid and care and sharing of resources and everyone else be damned. This is not the world vision of degrowth communism, but I think that I wonder sometimes, can you have degrowth without capitalism is sort of one question. And another question is, can you have degrowth without leftist politics? And I think your vision of degrowth, no, like that.
Yeah, that's what
not what you're talking about.
rather call like climate fascism. It's
Right.
the sign, kind of the vision of the future that will be realized by capitalism. If we don't move
Right.
to the degrowth kind of society, I think is exactly
That's the
what
road
you
we're
just
going down.
like build a wall, and within that climate fascist regime, like people in the United States will enjoy all those like resources and the lands, but then outside, the people in the global south, they kind of starve and die. That's kind of the future. Is what I imagine as climate fascism. And degrowth is rather more about democratic idea, international. And then that's why I kind of problematize in my book the Green New Deal. And Green New Deal could be, of course, like kind of degrowth oriented, but only after people start to accept the basic principles of degrowth. And then this hasn't happened yet. So I just have to keep insisting on the importance of degrowth communism over and over. Because what's happening with this global north, about Green New Deal and green growth, they're not really cared about people in the global south. It's just about massive extraction of new resources like lithium, cobalt, nickel, and like these resources will be massively extracted, and then the lands in the global south will be just expropriated. And then the unequal exchange of cheap labor, cheap resources will continue. They will just go to the global north, and then electric vehicles, wind turbine, solar panels will be built. But then those like expensive products will be exported to the global south, and then again, the expansion of global inequality, and that kind of things could continue. And then this is really the continuation of what I call, according to my friends Ulrich Brandt and Max Wissen, the imperial mode of living. Now, this is really the affluent life in the global north is at the cost of people and the environment in the global south. And I don't think if we continue this, there's no point of doing Green New Deal, because the climate crisis is really the manifestation of the imperial mode of living created by capitalism. So if we really want to challenge this radical or like this really serious crisis, I think the solution must be also very radical. And sometimes people say, oh, this is planetary crisis, it's very dangerous, so just invest 2% of the GDP in the green technologies and we'll be fine. Come on, the solution and the crisis is not matching. I think if you are really serious about climate crisis and recognize the danger, I think the solution must be the very radical one, something that we could not usually imagine in the peacetime. And without doing this, I think, this process of questioning our common sense is time-consuming, because people think, oh, it's not realistic, and people misunderstand and criticize, and many discussions, unproductive sometimes. And I understand, but at the same time, without this questioning of our rationality, we will repeat the kind of colonization, imperialism, and increase inequality and so on. But this is not leading to anywhere that Green New Deal proposers actually advocate for. And they seem to undermine that kind of negative aspects. I think if we really face to this contradiction of capitalism, first, I think, your approach is good. I kind of agree. In reality, we have to have some kind of hybrid of Green New Deal and degrowth. But many people don't even mention degrowth, right? They don't even mention, for example, ban private jets and so on, because it sounds more attractive. Green New Deal is about creating jobs, higher wages, and then just buying Tesla cars for everyone. It sounds so easy and attractive. But then if I talk about just reduce domestic flights and so on, people don't find green.
Those are two
New
different
Deal.
things. I think people love talking about banning private jets. They just don't want to like reduce domestic flights.
Yeah. So I mean, like we can start with something easy, right? Something that we don't use. So that's really something unnecessary. But at the same time, yeah. So I think just being popular, like being left populist, is sometimes dangerous.
But when I hear about aviation, I think, okay, so I just read a report last week that the carbon footprint of the global plastics industry is 4 times the size of the global aviation industry. And we have a much harder time imagining what it would mean to really shut that down. Even air transportation, which we think of as impossible to imagine to shut down, it's a lot easier to imagine shutting that down than shutting down the plastics industry. And that just calls to mind, again, like the scale of this challenge. And that's why I do think of it in kitchen sink terms, because it's like too big to solve in any one way. You got to throw everything at it. But I would ask you, Kohei, you talked about 3 sort of abstract categories. You have climate fascism, you have a kind of green growth, Green New Deal, and you have degrowth. And you analyzed why, you talked about why you feel, the system and the crisis suggests a solution that's, dominated by degrowth, maybe some aspects of Green New Deal, but dominated by degrowth. But as an analyst of the way that climate politics has evolved over the last 5 years, do you feel like we're heading, how would you describe the path that we're heading on? Are we heading, if you like zoom back in time to 2018, 2019, are we heading more from that point to climate fascism? Are we heading more from that point to a Green New Deal approach? Are we heading more from that point to a degrowth approach? Like, how do you assess the sort of shifting political landscape?
The general tendency is obviously climate fascism, right? Because the war in Ukraine and Russia is about land. So it's really the invasion, like a new kind of imperialist expansion in the age of ecological crisis, where the lands could be scarce and so on. And then what's happening in Gaza too, these are really the expansion, and then the kind of apartheid, climate apartheid that will be imposed in Gaza is really the manifestation of climate fascism. Like, or Trump comes back and then he's gonna again try to build the wall between Mexico and the US, and it's really the attempt to expel all those climate refugees from Latin America and so on. So the general tendency, I would say, is climate fascism, and then what they're doing right now is really the kind of rehearsal for the coming imperialist geopolitics in the age of ecological crisis. But at the same time, if we pick up some small ideas, small policies in the world, we can find new degrowth kind of consciousness. For example, my recent favorite example is Amsterdam. They are working with Kate Raworth, trying to introduce some of the donut economics in the city. Then one of the recent policy is that they decided to ban the new construction of hotels because just the over-tourism is quite excessive in Amsterdam. So that kind of things, like France also introduced to ban the short-distance domestic flight, like 2 hours or something. Like, they also try to impose certain kind of excessive consumption under capitalism. It's too slow, too little compared to the crisis of the scale. But I think that kind of a transformation of consciousness is taking place, especially among the younger generation. And this is something that could accelerate because the old people die and the younger people, your generation, have more serious ecological consciousness, and maybe that becomes more revolutionary, I hope.
I've definitely heard this as a solution to certain political issues. It's just some people need to die.
Well, I think on some level that's the best argument for degrowth, at least as a tool, is that, we just don't have the time to wait for that.
Exactly. So that's a contradiction. I have to admit, degrowth, because the climate crisis has a time limit. And then Green New Deal or green growth is not enough because growth often is accompanied by the increase of energy and resources. So that's really shifting the goal backwards. And so, but at the same time, degrowth is slow. It doesn't quite as fast as we expect. So what should we do? We just doomed.
Well, I mean, my view is that whatever we should do, what we're likely to do is continue heating the planet less quickly, less dramatically than we were a decade or two ago, but for the foreseeable future. Subject many more people than we needed to an awful lot of climate suffering, and define that suffering as a normal feature of the geopolitical landscape, and not do all that much about it. And that's kind of a moral abomination, but that's if I had to tell a story about what I expect to happen over the next 50 years, that's the story I would tell.
No, but my favorite example is like when I entered the college in 2005, I went to Wesleyan University in Connecticut. No one was talking about socialism. And then after 20 years, I wrote this book, and then I was invited by Georgetown University to talk about degrowth and communism. It's a big change.
And in another 20 years, you'll be running EPA
or something like that. But it's thanks to in the last 10 years, there are like many discussions in the US about the democratic socialism, like some kind of really the shift of interest. And then like 10 years ago, we also didn't think that the climate crisis is such a serious problem. So over the course of 10 years, of course, the political system, it takes more time to change. But our values and common sense could change over a night about feminism, about race, about capitalism. I think it has significantly changed in the last 10 years or so. I think many people agree. So maybe in 10, 20 years, everyone thinks the degrowth is just something attractive.
He said, hopefully. So I'm going to take a few questions from students, and I want to encourage those of you here to continue submitting questions. I'll keep taking questions. So this one feels important. What impact would degrowth have on developing countries in the global south? We're talking about degrowth in terms of reducing throughput in global north economies that are already sort of excessively developed. What does this mean for the global south?
The excessiveness in the global north, or like overdevelopment in the global north, is accompanied necessarily by the underdevelopment or scarcity of the global south. So what I try to advocate is basically by reducing the consumption and production in the global north, we try to make more resources available for the global south, so that creates a room for the development. So that basically degrowth is confined to the global north, I would say.
And I think that that's the best argument to make. I mean, Meehan, you were talking about this sort of earlier, but to think about this project as something that is effectively enabling what needs to happen among the poorest countries in the world, and doing what we can in parts of the wealthy world to make that happen. I think, when we get into debates about degrowth and its validity, so often we are talking within the narrow confines of our domestic politics and our little elite privilege, and debating about what Americans are going to accept, what Europeans are going to accept. But ultimately, it's the global context that I think makes the strongest argument for some of these measures, because just of the horrifying inequalities involved in our current systems.
And I hate IMF and the World Bank, but even if they are successful, if they try to, import certain kind of the modernization that is based on the American economic development, I think our world is doomed to, destroy the entire planet. Our ecological limit is much closer and tighter. So really, it's necessary that the global north now needs to present a new model of development that we can actually enjoy. Otherwise, India, Brazil, China, they will try to be like Americans, and that doesn't work. But we cannot say, oh, Chinese people don't be like Americans because we just want to, limit our joy to ourselves. That's very arrogant, and then that also creates the divide even wider. So I think in order to overcome this global north-south divide, so that we can really tackle the climate crisis as a planetary issue, that we work together, it's necessary that we recognize the negative aspects of the economic growth accompanied by colonialism and different kinds of bad things, then present new model of living.
But I think there's also a profoundly liberatory, materially liberatory potential in this for countries that want to develop, to find their own pathways to development. Because when you have a country where 80% of arable land that can be used for crops is being used to grow crops that are then exported for use in the global north, you have a country that cannot create a commons, right? You have a country that has no land commons to share. If you have a global economic system in which you have global north companies and multinational companies and governments and the IMF and the World Bank keeping the price of labor low in countries where global north economies need that cheap labor. And so you have all of these policies, including debt policies and other kinds of policies that keep labor very, very cheap and keep people working very, very hard such that their work is expropriated for the profit of companies that are multinational companies or in the global north. There is no way for a country to develop itself out of that sort of headlock. And if you remove profit as the driving impulse of the economy, then of the global economy, then you create room for other kinds of global development that maybe the elite in the global north hadn't imagined yet, right? That might be more appropriate to other countries in the global south that can find their own way. And this really was what was happening in the sort of first wave of decolonization after the 70s. You had countries that were sort of trying to find their own ways, and then you had the sort of neoliberal global agenda that came in and sort of crushed that. But what if countries were again free to try their own modes of development with the full knowledge of ecological catastrophe and the full knowledge of depleting soils and the full knowledge of what labor is actually worth and what happens when you commodify things like healthcare or education, right? There might be very different kinds of paths forward, which to me feels exciting.
And if you do imagine a sort of more stable, renewable-based energy future, it's also one in which many poorer countries of the world have much more energy autonomy, which is, I think, kind of critically important.
Right. Another question: how can degrowth sustain a growing global population? And this is a very interesting question, I think, because degrowth scholars, to my knowledge, mostly sort of elide the question of population, whereas the sort of ecological economists who have sounded the alarm about environmental catastrophe, which is not just climate, by the way, right? This is deforestation and the biodiversity crisis and nitrogen depletion and all of these various co-ecological crises that are happening. They do factor population in. That it's not necessarily that more people means more ecological degradation, because it depends on how people are organized to use available resources, right? But people use resources. So how does degrowth imagine this world of growing population?
So one is basically degrowth, as I said, is mainly about the global north developed countries. And then these are the countries where the population, like Japan, is going to decrease or is already decreasing. So it means that on that side, we don't have to actually grow, because why did we need growth? Originally, the population was growing. But then if the population is decreasing, I think we don't have to count on growth anymore. But of course, as you pointed out, even in the global south, these are the poor countries that they are not now that much responsible for the carbon dioxide emission, but at the same time, they still use a lot of resources and deforestation. But these are often the problems created due to the kind of the underdevelopment. For example, they trade wild animals, the commodification of wild animals, excessive deforestation because of the lack of the resources for the proper agriculture. And these are the issues created exactly by that kind of underdevelopment. So if we try to fix this overdevelopment and the underdevelopment, the poor countries also try to, learn. And one of the things that really decreases the maternity rate is basically education of women, right? So I think that kind of reform, creating the gender equality, also leads to mitigate this population increase and so on. So I think, probably that's partially answers that question.
And most demographers expect that the global population will peak in a few decades and then decline. So even on the time scale of the end of our lives, we'll probably not be in a position where we're wrestling with, reckoning with, and trying to accommodate a growing global population, but one in which the opposite problems sort of present themselves, although there's so much regional variation there.
I wonder also if there's a there's very different context in talking about degrowth in Japan, say, or parts of Europe where population decline is already happening, and where you're getting as kind of de facto economic stagnation, where the economy is, as you said before, sort of already not growing. Population is already going down. In some ways, the U.S. just hasn't caught up yet, and so there's a way in which our American kind of ideology and politics is still really rooted in this idea of no, it can keep going, we can keep going, right? And other countries are already at the point where it's just sort of not an option to keep growing, and therefore the viability of degrowth politically might seem potentially more realistic.
I mean, there's also something interesting going on there where a lot of economists would say that the reason that the U.S. is, one of the main reasons the U.S. is doing so well economically is because we're having so much immigration.
Right.
But there's a way of thinking of immigration as sort of extractive as well. And of course, it's produced a huge backlash and we may be dealing with some political obstacles to it in the future. But if the U.S. is in an unusual spot because we're not experiencing population decline, one of the reasons that we're in that spot is because we've historically had relatively open borders to people who wanted to come in, and that future is very much unclear.
Another student question: does limiting personal consumption contribute meaningfully to degrowth?
No.
Because it depends on what you actually
You can see the
limit, right? And but my book actually starts by criticizing those kind of individual change. Of course, I mean it's better not to eat meat than eating so many meat. But at the same time, just you becoming vegetarian doesn't change the situation either. So maybe it's better to spend your energy and time to change the society. You try to organize your friends and work with the university to divest from whatever bad things, and that kind of activities have much more impact than simply you giving up hamburgers, right? So I think it's really the way of using your energy and resources must be different. And the other thing is, however, that I think limit is not a negative thing. Mm-hmm. This is also one thing that I want to emphasize today. Like limit, you think is just like loss of freedom, loss of choice, loss of joy. No, it's by limiting yourself, because capitalism is about infinite growth. And then you try to grow, you try to be rich, but then there are always richer people, and then you never become happy. You buy new things, big car, but then there's a bigger cars and then more, better ones, bigger houses. And always this competition never ends, and you never become happy. So, because we are actually finite beings, we have to recognize that we cannot be infinite beings. But the capital try to be like an infinite one, and then they compels us to work for them, or for capital. But my point is basically by recognizing that limitation, we actually gain more freedom. Maybe you don't need so much money to satisfy your desires, and spend instead time with your family and friends. And these are the ways that you can actually enjoy yourself. Maybe eating less meat is bringing you a healthier life, right? So just think in a different way, and then makes everything fine.
In that part of the book, you write about individual action as the equivalent of an indulgence from the Catholic Church, basically, that it's like something you do to make yourself feel better about the sins that you're committing in a daily way. Putting aside the sort of political value, the moral virtues of a degrowth-like approach, at a psychological level, do you think that that's also, the indulgence model is also driving interest in degrowth? That is, people want to attach themselves to this idea in part as a way of making themselves feel better about the system that they're otherwise participating in?
Yeah, I'm not negating all the individual changes. In the end, I think I end my book with 3.5%. It's really the small number of people really bravely stand up, and then they could have significant impact. But we often just simply believe that individual choices cannot change. But then, so I think we really have to act, we have to gain the confidence in our small powers. Like we can make big changes with small number of people, but at the same time, just limiting personal choice is not the best way. Yes, yeah.
I think there's also good reason to be skeptical about personal consumption being the place where we have agency or power, partly because that's what giant corporations have told us to think, right? And anytime you get the fact that BP is the one who popularized the personal carbon footprint because they wanted you to stop thinking about BP. They wanted you to think about your toilet paper. And if you can spend a lot of time and energy thinking about your toilet paper. There's a lot of Googling to be done. There's a lot of different stores to go to. And when you do that, as you say, you're using your attention and energy for an effort that's actually about consumption. And it actually reduces you to the role of a consumer as opposed to a person with political agency in the world. That being said, I do think that there are reasons for changing personal behaviors, but they're maybe not the reasons you think they are. Like, it's not going to solve climate change and it's not going to bring about degrowth. However, there's all kinds of studies that show that changing your personal habits tends to increase conversation among social groups, which actually tends to follow out in voting habits. Right? So maybe your different toilet paper can kind of ripple effect out into someone else getting elected, right? That's not why you thought you were changing your toilet paper, but that is a good reason to change personal habits, to change culture, right? Another good reason to change your personal habits is really just to reaffirm to yourself personally, privately, not as virtue signaling of like, I don't need meat anymore, but to make those private small decisions that remind you what your values are. And that in itself can be sort of like rooting and clarifying. Again, it's not going to change the capitalist system. You're still buying things. But I think there was a moment of sort of like backlash against any kind of personal choice being meaningful at all. And I think it's worth saying, yes, personal choices do matter. And also you are more than a consumer and you can act like that. Let's see, another question. What role can university research play in advancing the concept of degrowth?
Oh, I think the Georgetown should now establish
the Department of Degrowth.
Yeah. But this is really true. I mean, I'm kind of serious. Like some university needs to start like having the Department of Degrowth or something like that, because Department of Economics, especially in the U.S., is totally occupied by this kind of the mainstream economists. In Japan it's a little bit different. I'm a Marxian economist, and I was able to teach at the Department of Economics before I moving to the University of Tokyo. Now I teach philosophy, but there's a kind of diversity, and the problem is degrowth is often treated as some kind of non-academic, it's not a non-serious idea. And then that means that even though we try to develop models and we try to develop like international collaborations, we try to learn from, gather experiences all over the world, we don't get enough budget and resources because that thing is like totally marginalized. And I think the situation has gradually changed, especially in Europe. My friends, Yorgos Kallis and Jason Hickel, and they're really establishing a very good place in Barcelona. But I think that kind of serious kind of research needs to start. But the money is often coming from corporations, the money is coming from the state, and then they have power. What kind of discourses are regarded as valid, also like has authority and so on. And the degrowth had been marginalized. And I think this is really the challenge that we are trying to bring. And once we have enough resources, we have more results, and then the IPCC integrate all those degrowth perspective, and then they will also, the politician may pay more attention to what degrowth economists say and so on. But today, it's really this discipline of existing academic institution functions in a way that suppress new ideas, like post-capitalism, socialism, and communism and degrowth.
David, I'm curious, in a sort of a mosaic approach, right? If we wanted to start talking about like how does degrowth actually happen in the world, I'm curious what you see as necessary for either for degrowth to be taken seriously or to be sort of adopted in the ways that it can be in places where it could be useful. What would need to happen?
Well, one thing I wonder is whether the term is a real problem. That in certain ways it motivates and mobilizes a subset of potential sympathizers. I think in part for the reasons I was mentioning earlier, because it makes us feel like if we proclaim that we are supporters of degrowth, then we are guiltless as participants in the system in which we live. But I do wonder whether many of the values that you're describing would have a broader audience and broader appeal if they were described in less antagonistic terms and less accusatory terms towards the system in which many of the people we're trying to reach are living in some complicated, ambivalent relationship, not persuaded that everything about the system in which they live, in the world in which they live, is evil, but one in which they just want to modify things around the edges. I think like as a piece of attention-getting political theater, sort of, the word degrowth is very effective. Like people talk about it way more than they would if they talk about degrowth way more than they talk about donut economics, for instance, which is like another, kind of another rhetorical approach to a similar set of ideas. But if what you're hoping for is a world in which, the public at large has bought in, I do worry about that term as the term.
There is also the sort of like radical response to that, which is, there are a lot of, you can think of like colonialism for a long time. That was a really good thing, right? We're doing colonialism. We're going out and saving the world from itself and doing science and all of those things. Decolonialization or decolonizing became a way of thinking about a way that the world was that was in fact not so great. And that decolonizing acknowledges the limitations and the profound harms of that previous mode of existing, right? And so part of this feels like a profound cultural change would be needed for degrowth to be seen as positive in the way that sort of decolonizing is seen as positive, because we culturally have come to a place where we realize that growth, in fact, is just driving us all off the cliff. And so maybe degrowth sounds more positive if you change those terms.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I think of it as like, are we asking this question, thinking about this challenge about the intellectual analysis on offer, or are we asking about it as a piece of political rhetoric that with a popular agenda? And I'm completely persuaded that degrowth is useful in illuminating. From an analytic point of view, the question is whether it makes more enemies than it recruits allies out in the world, and TBD.
Yeah, and there are many people who say degrowth as a political, it's just bad politics. It's not going to work, so don't.
But when you get into the constituent parts of it, most people in the rich parts of the world are sympathetic. So the question is, whether there's greater value in organizing it as a sort of rallying cry set, or whether it makes more sense to talk about each of those agenda items somewhat separately. I think it's hard for me. It's hard to answer definitively one way or the other.
This is a student question that I'm going to just turn into more of a comment than a question, which is, why don't you use the concept of growth instead? Growth in humanity, dignity, justice, distribution. It's just a different kind of growth, perhaps.
Well, this is, a lot of what we're talking about is, are we really talking about degrowth, or are we really just talking about redefining growth?
Redefining, So, Harman Daly distinguishes growth and development. Growth is quantitative, development is more qualitative. And that's one way. But we basically try to redefine growth, decolonize growth, and also redefine the idea of abundance. It's not just simply more material goods and bigger cars and houses. It's about communal wealth, and so redefine the concept of wealth. Redefine many things, right? Redefine the goal of our life, redefining the limit, not as unfreedom, but as freedom. And I think this is very revolutionary because capitalism makes us accept certain way of thinking. And this is like a homo economics rationality. But once we start questioning and redefining our common sense, it's possible that just justification of the capitalist system will fall apart. Then people do not find it attractive anymore, right? So like, why do we like pay tax for killing people somewhere else, or why do we, work so hard when our job is so unstable, and what's the purpose or meaning of our life, and so on? That kind of questioning can be a very important question, and that's what I try to do as a philosopher when I put forward this concept of degrowth communism. I'm not saying that politicians would accept and they try to introduce these ideas because it's, I understand it's not feasible, it's not like realistic and so on, but I think it's a good way of really redefining our common sense.
Another student question here. There are concurrent wars happening in Gaza, Ukraine, Syria, Sudan, Tigray, and too many places elsewhere. Is it possible to apply a degrowth model to places that are rebuilding after a conflict? What would that look like?
I don't know when this thing will end, right? I mean, it's really hard, but I think it's really degrow the U.S. military is one of the top priority. If I have the right to distinguish what's unnecessary and what's necessary in the U.S. economy, obviously this excessive military budget is something unnecessary. And I'm not saying immediately abandon all those like militaries, but that it's clear that's excessive. And then once you realize this excessiveness in military budget, and then you realize so many excessiveness around you in this world. So these all the wars are also partially because of all those imperial tradition in the long history, and but that's why I kind of emphasize the importance of the decolonization aspect, which is often marginalized in the Green New Deal discussion. Yeah, this is something that we need to really take seriously, and I think degrowth is a good way of starting thinking about these kind of things.
But even pulling back the sort of, and from the, degrowth is something that we have to talk about in the global north and applying it to those countries in particular. I mean, obviously, in the aftermath of a war, the important question to ask is not how fast the GDP is growing. The important question to ask is, are the people safe? Is healthcare provided? Is there an educational system that's available? Can families count on stability and safety from harm? And these are all questions that are not quantified in any of our measures, codified, by economics departments or whatever. These are much more profound needs, and that's, although it's not exactly what you're talking about when you're talking about degrowth on a global scale, it does remind us just of the centrality of these values as opposed to the ones that we've been taught should organize all of our political lives.
And also the things that we measure, right? If you're not measuring, I think Bhutan has the measure of gross national happiness, right? But it's like the only country that has a national measure for something that's not GDP by which to sort of chart its course, right? If you went into a war zone or an area of conflict, and rather than figuring out how to profit on rebuilding it, you were actually trying to figure out how to make the lives of the people there better, you might measure different things and therefore have different yardsticks for outcomes.
Yeah, we really need a different measure. The value, like measured by money, is not like efficient enough. Like if we think about the pandemic, many people died, and the people's life cannot be measured. The cost of the worth of the planet cannot be measured, and those like ecological dimension or like social well-being cannot be adequately measured by money. And this is really also the experience of war, right? During the war economy, we have to put more importance on other things than profit. The profit is no longer the sole measure of our society in the war economy. And this is really the lesson that we can actually learn from the 1920s, and that's the time that where people actually start discussing about different kinds of economic organization. And maybe climate crisis is the same thing. It's a real new war economy that we are entering, and then that we cannot simply count on the market logic. It's dangerous. Because this is about, again, profit, not about your needs and necessity. So once we really continue that kind of things forever, that's really the failure of our policies, and it will not be a good thing for many of us.
So I was given the 5-minute warning, so I'm going to do one last question. How can students contribute to sustainable practices on campus that align with degrowth principles? And this actually suggests another question to me, which is, can degrowth exist in like a mosaic form? Or does degrowth necessarily require the undoing of the entire capitalist system in order to undo the
Definitely not. Like,
how does degrowth work in pockets? How on a campus, how could one see degrowth happen?
Because communism is already within capitalism. Yeah? It's what David Graeber said about the baseline communism. The communism is even in the McKinsey or Goldman Sachs, and because the workers help each other. Yeah? There are many relationships in capitalism that are not pivoting around commodity exchange, money, and that kind of, equal exchange, that kind of thing. Rather, there are many mutual aids and help and care that are actually the basis of capitalist way of living too. So that's communism is the underlying premise of capitalist way of living. Then why, if we have communism still in capitalism, why don't we expand that kind of way of living? And then what I say is basically degrowth communism is also everywhere. But the problem is students often end up wasting your talents, great talents, by selling your talents to some big corporations. So it's just a waste of your creativity and talents, I would say. There are so many ways, because the US, there are so many talented people and so many capacity to produce new things. But all those things are all those things are invested in generating more money and profit. So that's really the waste of resources. I think this is, once you realize this, there are so many ways that you can actually don't have to necessarily devote your entire time and life to degrowth anti-capitalist activity. You can start like with small things too, but then questioning this unquestioned value and goal, fostered during your life in capitalism is really creating a space of anti-capitalist new imaginary and revolution, maybe.
And I would just say, to your version of the question, Meehan, it's like the university is already a mosaic space. We take our books out of the library. There's transportation made available.
However, it's super expensive in the US.
Well,
in Germany and the other countries, it's free. So yes, I totally.
Yeah. But in the way that life is lived on campus is partakes of a lot of the values of degrowth. The problem, as you say, is like what happens to people when they leave campus and what they're doing there. But to me, it also is a reminder that, like, in this context particularly, the challenge is like, yes, there are ways we should be living more communally. There are ways that we should establish more mutual aid. But even in a setting like the university where a lot of that is going on already, we still have these really big challenges like, where's our power coming from? Where's our electricity coming from? Where's our food coming from? These are huge systematic changes that are necessary to make even a place that's otherwise quite idyllic, to bring a place like that into line with climate stability. And those are, for me at least, challenges that are answered at least as well by industrial solutions and technological solutions as by a toolkit of degrowth. Like if Georgetown has to run on green power, like we gotta put some solar panels up, we gotta put some windmills up. That kind of has to happen.
Degrow Georgetown.
That seems like a really good note to end on. Thank you all for coming today.